पार्थाय प्रतिबोधितां भगवता नारायणेन स्वयं व्यासेन ग्रथितां पुराणमुनिना मध्ये महाभारतम् अद्वैतामृतवर्षिणीं भगवतीम् अष्टादशाध्यायिनीम् अम्ब त्वामनुसन्दधामि भगवद्गीते भवद्वेषिणीम् यं ब्रह्मा वरुणेन्द्ररुद्रमरुदस्तुन्नन्ति दिव्यैस्तवैः वेदैः साङ्गपदक्रमोपनिषदैः गायन्ति यं सामगाः ध्यानावस्थिततद्गतेन मनसा पश्यन्ति यं योगिनो यस्यान्तं न विदुःसुरासुरगणाः देवाय तस्मै नमः। We are discussing the 23rd verse of the 6th chapter, the Dhyana Yoga of Bhagavad Gita. Tam vidya duḥkha-sanyoga-viyogam yoga samkidam sa nischayena yoktavyo yogo anirvinna chetasah. So tam vidya duḥkha-sanyoga-viyogam. So duḥkha-sanyoga means agony, pain, unhappiness, and so on. And duḥkha-sanyoga-viyogam means severance, separating from us this duḥkha-sanyoga. That is actually duḥkha-viyoga, getting rid of this dukkha. Freedom from dukkha. How does it happen? How we can get rid of the feeling of incompleteness or imperfection? Because the basic goal of human life, though we understand it or not, consciously or unconsciously, what we are all striving for is to get rid of an inherent feeling of incompleteness. Every effort, not only secular activities, even spiritual activities, are also attempt to obtain some kind of a duḥkha-sanyoga-viyogam, mean getting rid of an inherent feeling of incompleteness or imperfection or unhappiness, so to speak. In other words, every human effort is an effort to obtain happiness or satisfaction. We eat food because we feel hungry, so it is a state of incompleteness or imperfection. People work hard for money because they think that will give them happiness. People do spiritual practices, they perform spiritual disciplines because they think that spiritual practices will bring a state of permanent happiness. So every human endeavor is ultimately an attempt to attain this permanent happiness. Now, here is one important point to be understood. Every experience of happiness at the empirical level, in our ordinary level of worldly experiences, every happiness contains in it an element of hidden unhappiness. The happiness that we experience today may disappear or may decrease. It doesn't remain in the same condition throughout. So, when we experience less happiness tomorrow than what we experience today, that leads to some kind of unhappiness. So every experience of happiness contains in it an inherent possibility, an unavoidable possibility of unhappiness. So, what is the source of real happiness, real capital, permanent, unchanging happiness? Vedanta tells us that for that we have to look at happiness and unhappiness from a higher perspective. Then we won't be attached to happiness. We won't be always looking for happiness. And when we stop looking for happiness all the time, then mind reaches a state where it is never unhappy. That's because it is not looking for happiness at the empirical level. Because it understands, when we understand that every experience of happiness at the empirical worldly level cannot be permanent. It can only be a temporary absence of happiness, unhappiness. Every experience at the worldly level is only a temporary absence or a temporary suspension of unhappiness. We are postponing an experience of unhappiness when we are enjoying, when we are experiencing happiness. There is no cessation of unhappiness, there is only postponement, a suspension of unhappiness. So that's why Vedanta says, duḥkha-sanyoga-viyogam, the severance from the contact of unhappiness can happen only when we are able to look upon happiness and unhappiness with the same equanimity of mind, when we are not always obsessed with happiness, when we are not always looking for happiness, then we will never be unhappy. Now, this is a state of mind where we are able to look upon happiness and unhappiness without either attachment or aversion. So, according to Yoga and Vedanta, this state of permanent happiness, permanent contentment is beyond happiness and unhappiness as we understand in the worldly sense. And at that stage, the difference, what you call the tribhuti, the three elements, that mean the one who knows and what is known and the process of knowing, knowledge. Jnata, jnanam, jnaya, adhyata, dhyanam, dheya vastu, as we call Vedanta. It disappears when we look upon ourselves as essentially an embodiment of the absolute reality, which is beyond happiness and unhappiness. So long as we look upon ourselves as mind or body, we cannot have permanent contentment or happiness. Because mind can never experience the same degree of happiness all the time. Body also cannot experience happiness all the time. The senses also do not experience happiness all the time. So when we identify ourselves as the transcendental reality, the Atman that's beyond all these senses, body and mind, and when we identify ourselves, when we live in that identity, identifying ourselves with Atman, then there will be no unhappiness, and that's a real happiness in the true sense. It is called sukham atyandikam yed buddhigrahim atindriyam. We already discussed. Atyandikam sukham. It is actually Anandamaya Kosha according to Vedantic tradition. Going beyond that, there is an Atyanta Sukham. You can find Lord Krishna is going to discuss this in the coming verses. Atyanta Sukha means Brahmanandam, the highest spiritual contentment. And that is a state where we always identify ourselves with Atman and we always live in that identification of Atman. That is the only solution to all the problems. So all the great spiritual teachers the world has seen, they had this ability to look upon happiness and unhappiness from a higher perspective. They were not always looking for happiness. So you find all the problems in the world are rooted in one central principle, the mysterious truth. That's because we are looking for happiness all the time. And that's because we have desires. So we have desires and we think that if we fulfill those desires, we will be happy. But the moment our desires are fulfilled, then another set of desires crop up again and this continues. So one of our verses in the Mahabharata says, it's just like trying to put out fire by pouring melted butter into it. The fire will not be put out if you pour oil or butter or ghee or melted butter in it. It doesn't happen. So this discussion continues in one or two verses. Then some very important spiritual ideas are discussed here. Sankalpa prabhavan kaman tyaktva sarvan aseshataha manasavendriya gramam viniyamya samantataha. So sankalpa prabhavan kaman tyaktva sarvan aseshataha. We should abandon, we should give up all desires without any reserve, aseshataha, completely. And all these desires are born of sankalpa. So what is sankalpa? We will discuss that earlier. And we'll continue again. And then we should be able to completely restrain our senses using mind alone from their objects. So the senses drag the mind into all kinds of objects. So manasaiva indriya gramam. So indriya gramam means all the senses put together, all indriyas put together. The community of indriyas is called. Viniyamya samantataha. So sankalpa, that means brooding over, thinking about, pondering about worldly objects, thinking that if we can possess those objects, we'll be happy. So mind is always being dragged outside of itself. The eyes take the mind to certain visual objects. Then the mind develops a desire to possess it. It's not necessarily because it needs it. We don't have desire just because we need those things. For often, needs are created by circumstances. That's an important point. Remember, frequently people say that we get attached to things because we need them. In fact, most of what we get attached to are things that we do not really need. So, whatever we see with our eyes, immediately the mind will develop a desire to possess them. Even though we know fully well that we don't need them. Even know fully well that it may be a trap if you spend long hours in internet advertisement. We never knew certain things existed in the world. And suddenly some visual objects will throw up the images of things. Immediately we feel that we need them to satisfy our mind. So the desire. Because the desires are created by circumstances. And the eyes will bring visual objects of desire. And ears will bring audible objects of desire. So also the sense of taste will bring a desire to eat things which we may not need, which can even be poisonous to us. Still, the mind will develop a desire. Desires are not because we like them. Desires are because we connect with those objects with our senses. So naturally, the mind develops the false notion that we need those objects in order to satisfy, in order to have enjoyment, in order to experience happiness. We need those things. That's how Buddhism also says Trishna. That Trishna, the desire, is responsible for the continued cycles of life. If you have one desire yet to be fulfilled, you have to be born again to fulfill those desires. This is the belief system in most of the Oriental religious traditions. Now Vedanta is going to teach us again here that mind should be slowly lifted with steady practice, reading scriptures, creating new, more desirable desires, healthy desires, sublime desires, spiritually more helpful desires. So the first step to get out of worldly desires is to develop a spiritual desire, because that will purify your samskaras. Worldly desires create greed, will create a desire to get things, and that may pollute the mind, that may create hidden traps in the mind, and insatiable, endless desire. So mind always remains greedy and dissatisfied. So if we can develop some spiritual desire, reading scriptures, reading great books, or maybe a desire to do some noble deeds, selfless, unselfish things for the good of others. These desires will create healthy tendencies. Of course, they also can lead to agony and unhappiness, because any kind of desire is bound to create agony and unhappiness. But advantage is, once you develop a higher desire, then those higher spiritually more helpful desires will eventually take you to a state where you are totally free from desires. So that's why Vedanta says sankalpa prabhavan kaman, all sankalpas. Sankalpas here means ideas, desires, brooding over worldly objects in order to possess them, thinking that they can give us permanent happiness. So in order to get rid of this problem, in this 24th and 25th verses, Lord Krishna gives some very important suggestions. One is restrain, control the desires through correct sankalpa. Have some good sankalpas. Have some good sublime goals to attain, great things to do, great desires, which are rooted in unselfishness, not greed. I want to read some great books. I want to practice some spiritual disciplines. I want to know more about spiritual life. It's a great desire. It's a great sankalpa. So all wrong sankalpas can be got rid of by creating one great spiritual sankalpa. And that will prompt us to direct our efforts, our energy, our action, our activities in a proper direction. And then what happens, our samskaras, the mental system will be purified by these spiritual desires, and that will help us to slowly control the senses from external objects. So a mind or antakarana means mind, mana, buddhi, chitta, ahankara, mind, intellect, sense of egoism or egoity, and the memory system, together called antakaranas, that whole mental system, so to speak. If we can fill our mental system, our mental world, our mind with some higher sankalpas, with some higher ideas, that will help us to slowly restrain our desire for worldly things, worldly enjoyments, and that will slowly purify the mind and eventually help us to get rid of all kinds of desires. But this should be done slowly. Mind should be slowly lifted to a higher level. In the coming verses, Lord Krishna gives a very, very scientific analysis of how a spiritual seeker should slowly lift his mind from the level of worldly desires to higher spiritual ideas. In the 25th verse, which is very important and very well known in the Gita, from the standpoint of the spiritual psychology of Bhagavad Gita, you find Shanai Shanai Ruparamed Buddhya Dhriti Grihitaya Atma Samstham Manakrutva Na Kinchidapi Chintayet. So this buddhi, this intellect, should be set in patience with the mind linked to Atman. Let a spiritual seeker try to attain peace, quietude, shanai shanai, by degrees, slowly. So this is a very important verse. And he should not think of anything else. Now here there are a few important ideas implied here. What's the danger of doing things in a fast, in a hectic, at a fast pace? The risks, the dangers, the problems, and the hidden mental traps in taking up spiritual disciplines, meditation, or any other spiritual practice like pranayama or japa at breakneck speed. What are the dangers in doing things too fast? These are all taken up here. So one problem that spiritual scientists, when we talk about spiritual scientists, we are talking about Shankaracharya, we are talking about Sri Ramakrishna, we are talking about Patanjali Yoga Sutra, which contains many wonderful ideas which elaborate the risks and dangers of doing spiritual practices at breakneck speed. One thing is, if a person doesn't move slowly or steadily, at a steady speed, if he takes up meditation or any of these spiritual disciplines without proper direction, at breakneck speed, what happens? He can develop delusions, he can upset the mind, because in spiritual practices we are playing with our own mind. That's an important point. Na buddhi vedam janiyeda jnanam karma sankinam. If an individual is working hard with a definite plan, with a definite set goal to achieve, everything ready and planned, properly programmed, if you tell such a person, you should practice karma yoga without any desire, without any selfish attachment, you are actually upsetting his mental balance. It can lead to serious problems. If you tell a student who is working hard with a strong ambition to get a high level, high grade, or if you tell a professional who is working hard to get a promotion for success, if you tell such a person that he should practice karma yoga, that he should not have any desire, you are actually upsetting his mind. So that's why the sankalpa prabhavan kaman tyaktva karmanya seshataka. So these sankalpas play an important role. First, we must develop a strong, healthy sankalpa, a healthy ideal. To begin with, an interest in reading holy scriptures, an interest in associating with spiritual persons, an interest in visiting places of worship, or participating in discussions on spiritual topics. All these are the first steps. That is one way of Shanai Rupa Ramed. Slowly the mind should be lifted to a higher level. Mind should be directed towards a spiritual ideal, but slowly withdrawing, without upsetting its balance, but slowly withdrawing the mind from external objects, sensory objects, worldly objects. It should be done slowly. Otherwise, one can develop hallucinations, delusions and obsessions. So also while practicing mantras, people sometimes wrongly they assume that they can get a mantra from the internet and practice. Is very dangerous. Because for practicing certain mantras, we have to get our mind ready. Mantras are very potent word symbols. They are being chanted, recited and meditated upon by sages for thousands of years, for centuries. So they are potent word symbols. So slowly we must practice. At least we can feel slow degrees, not all of a sudden. Spending long hours reciting a particular mantra that you got from an internet or a YouTube, all these are risky. They may be in murder. I am giving examples from modern times. In ancient times, the teachers used to instruct the disciples stage by stage how to develop our mind, how to lift our mind from worldly objects to spiritual subjects, spiritual ideas, shanai, step by step, slowly. So, in the Atma Samstham Manakrutva, so slowly this mind should be linked to Atman. And before that, mind should be liberated from the clutches of the senses. And senses should be freed from the clutches of sense objects. So senses or indriyas should be withdrawn from sense objects so that senses won't bring unhealthy desires and ideas to the mind. And then the senses should be properly controlled the mind. The senses should not be allowed to control the mind. Rather, the mind should control the senses. And that mind, which is perfectly in control of the senses and sense objects, which is not controlled by the senses or sense objects, that mind should be linked to Atman. Then what happens? Mind becomes slowly steady and stable. In the next verse, Lord Krishna says, he is warning against certain possible dangers and risks which are frequently discussed in Patanjali Yoga Sutra also. Restlessness, unsteadiness, wandering the mind, conflicting thoughts. All these problems are implied here. Yato yado nischarati manaschanjalam asthiram tadastato niyamedad atmanneva vasham nayit. So, maybe whatever may be the reason, the restless, unsteady mind, it wanders away. So, mind has a tendency to wander about because mind is a continuous, often disconnected flow of thoughts, sometimes conflicting thoughts. The more there are conflicts, the more mind becomes restless. When there is some kind of a harmony in the thought process, mind is happy, it is restful, it is steady. But when this flow of thoughts becomes flow of conflicting thought currents, then that conflict of the thought currents will manifest as restlessness, unsteadiness of mind. So that's why Patanjali actually explains this from a different angle, which is a more thorough analysis. In the Samadhipada, for example, there is a sutra, Vyadhi Sthyana Samsya Pramada Alasya Aviradi Bhranti Darshana Alabdha Bhumigattu Anavasthitattvani Chitta Vikshepaha Te Antarayaha. So Patanjali is talking about this vikshepas, these digressions, distractions of mind, psychological problems or obstacles in the practice of meditation. And these problems are common to every spiritual seeker in every religious tradition. Not only in spiritual activities. When you try to do something noble and wonderful, not for your own selfish purpose, you find some of these conflicting thoughts will come. Because it seems as if the mind contains in it its own enemy. I mean, there is an inherent negativity in mind. Remember, this negativity can be controlled, can be transcended, can be removed when we become aware of this. So negativity can be controlled, can be restrained by filling our mental system with healthy, positive ideas. Give your mind healthy food, it becomes positive. Give your mind unhealthy food, then it bites you. Very often, like our pets, if you give unhealthy food to your pets, it may bite you. If you give good food, then it loves you, it protects you. So there are these 9 problems of mind that Patanjali is describing in this well-known verse in the Samadhipada. Vyadhi, Sthyana, Samsaya, Pramada, Alasya, Avirati, Bhranti Darshana, Alabdha Bhumigattvani, Anavasthitani, Chitta Vikshepaha, the Antaraya. It's called, technically called Antarayas. Means disease, languor, indecision, carelessness, sloth, sensuality, mistaken notion, missing the point, lack of stability. These are all distractions. And samsaya, pramada, alasya, aviradi, bhranti darshana. These are all very, very common. Doubts. And again, a tendency to do the wrong thing. And then bhranti darshana often manifests as delusions or hallucinations, sometimes delusions of grandeur. Sudden feeling comes that you have attained a great spiritual status. With a little practice, suddenly the wrong notion comes. We have progressed a lot. And sometimes, the wrong, again, missing the point. Anavasthitatvam. That is also sometimes a problem. And instability. Mistaken notion, sometimes laziness, alasya, sloth, pramada, carelessness, an easygoing attitude. So all these can come. So extreme effort under the mistaken notion that if we work hard, we can quickly progress. Or its opposite, alasya, sloth. All these can be distractions. But then, all these manifest one way or other in some kind of mind wandering about. That's why yato yato nischarati manas chanchalam asthiram. So mana is called chanchalam and asthiram. It is unsteady, and again it wanders about. So what we should do, we should bring this mind closely, again and again we should try to bring the mind within the proximity of Atman. That means mind becomes our friend when it comes closer to the Atman, and mind becomes our enemy when it moves away from Atman. Because Atman by its very nature is steadiness itself, stability itself, bliss itself, restfulness itself. That's what happens. That's why Atmanev Atmana Tushta Sthita Prajñas Tadochidi. Lord Krishna, in his answer to a question from Arjuna, who put a question to Lord Krishna, what are the characteristics of a spiritually enlightened person? Sthita Prajñasya ka bhasha, what's the language he speaks, how does he move about, etc. In answer to this, Lord Krishna gives this interesting reply. Prajagadi yada kaman sarvan pathmanogadan atmanev atmana tushtaha sthita prajñas tadochide. A person whose prajña, his mind, is always sthita, always stable, always established in serenity, quietude and stability. Such a person is every minute experiencing this inner tushti, inner contentment, inner happiness. He is working hard. Maybe he has many things to do, but he's always happy. He is not anxious. Though he is working hard to reach the deadline. He may be a professional. He may have a lot of things to do, and he has a definite plan, but he is not anxious. So what's the difference between a spiritually enlightened person and a normal person who has no interest in spiritual values? A person who has no interest in spiritual values will be working very hard, but is always anxious, worried and concerned and complaining, bitter if it doesn't succeed. Even if there is 100% possibility of success, still he is anxious and concerned and sometimes bitter. But a spiritually enlightened person may be working hard, maybe better, working harder, have many more things to do, but absolutely no complaint, absolutely not concerned at all, not at all anxious, but is working hard. That's because Atmani eva Atmana Tushtaha. He identifies himself with something other than mind. He identifies himself as Atman. And Atman is ever established in tranquility, peace and stability and restfulness. So if you can bring your mind closer and closer to Atman, then mind becomes a better and better friend of yours. Because mind becomes serene, it doesn't complain. It cooperates with you when you want to do something. It doesn't express itself in the form of totally irrational anxiety and worries. So slowly mind should be brought closer and closer to the Atman. How do we do this? How does mind come closer to Atman? When you feed your mind with ideas that remind you of your true Atman identity. That is, it could be done by reading books on spiritual subjects, by associating with spiritual persons, by participating in spiritual disciplines, even have an interest in spiritual disciplines. All these are different ways of depositing in your mind some spiritual ideas, so that mind will be full of spiritual vibrations and spiritual ideas. Then mind comes closer and closer to Atman. And then it doesn't wander about. That is, Sthita Prajna means a person whose mind is not wandering about. So that's why Tadastado niyamyedat atmanneva vasham nayet. So bring the mind under the control of Atman. Means in close proximity with Atman. Keep your mind ever linked, always linked to Atman. That's the idea behind. In the Gita Shankaracharya's commentary, Shankaracharya makes an interesting remark here in this 26th verse. Yato yato yasmat nimitta shabdadehe nischarati nirgachati. I mean, whenever this mind is getting disturbed, when it begins to wander about, when it begins to get moving about outside spiritual world, when it becomes restless or unstable or unsteady. Why? Subhava doshat. The point is subhava dosha. Because the mind contains in it a lot of unhealthy ideas, wrong ideas, spiritually harmful ideas, spiritually disturbing ideas. So what happens? Nirgachati subhava dosha, because of subhava dosha, because of some inherent problem of the mind. What is the inherent problem? If you deposit in our mind, if you feed our mind with bad food, put wrong ideas, wrong vibrations, then that mind becomes sick. And the sickness of the mind manifests in the form of wandering about unnecessarily everywhere. Manachanchalam atyartham chalam atate asthiram. It is always moving, wavering, so it is unsteady. Tadaha tasma shabdadehi nimittat niyamya tat nimittam yadhatmi rupena abhasi kritya vairagi bhavanaya cha edat mana atmani eva vasham nayed atmavasyadam apadayis. So, mana atmavasyadam apadayit. How do you bring the mind closer and closer with the control of mind, control of Atman? See, yadhatmi nirupanena. Yadhatmi nirupana means what is the real nature of reality? What is the true nature of reality? What's our reality? Are we just the mind? Are we just the senses? Are we just the body? What's our true nature? We are the Atman, the transcendental reality. So once we live in that memory of our Atman identity, then what happens, Mind may have lot of unnecessary disturbing ideas in a system, but the distraction slowly disappears. Mind has a tendency to identify itself as Atman. You see, when mind is turned inward, it identifies itself as Atman. When mind is turned outward, then it identifies with every sense object. Because when the mind is turned outward, then it flows into all kinds of objects in the external world. The visual objects it sees by eyes. The audio object, the sounds it hears. Then things that it touches through the sense of touch, things that it tastes through the sense of taste, and things that it smells through the sense of smell. So all the five senses are dragging the mind. So it always moves about, wanders about. But the same mind, when it is free from the tyranny of the senses, when it is turned towards Atman, Then what happens? That mind slowly assumes the characteristics of Atman. It becomes calm and quiet and serene. That's why Shankaracharya says, Niyamya tat tat nimittam yadhatmya nirupanena abhasi kritya vairagya bhavanaya, through a sense of renunciation, vairagya, a sense of renunciation of external things, external objects, through a sense of spiritual renunciation of external enjoyments. Once when we are able to fill our mind with these ideas of renunciation, the idea that the external things cannot give us complete happiness, then what happens? Mind slowly turns towards Atman, will turn it. And then it becomes serene, calm and quiet and tranquil. The idea continues, the 27th verse, Prashanta manasam hyenam yoginam sukhamuttamam. That sukham, the real sukham is mentioned here. Prashanta manasam hyenam yoginam sukhamuttamam upayadi shantarajasam brahmabhudam akalmasham. So mind becomes like an ocean with all waves completely subsided. That's what it means. Prashanta manasam hyenam. So, when mind identifies itself with Atman, the supreme bliss comes to the yogi. And then the mind is perfectly tranquil, peaceful, calm and serene. All passions completely gone, quieted. Then that say the yogi identifies himself with Atman, the yogi realizes his true identity with Atman, and he becomes totally free from any kind of disturbances. That's the idea behind. So the first step is to free the mind from the clutches, from the tyranny of the senses. The mind becomes pure. And then the mind also slowly gets directed towards Atman. Then, according to Vedanta philosophy, the avarana and vikshepa disappears. Vikshepa goes away because avarana goes away. Avarana means the veil, the curtain that conceals our true identity. And vikshepa is the resulting distractions. When the reality is not properly seen, then naturally we will form our own ideas about the reality. Because we do not realize our true nature, we interpret ourselves to be many things other than the reality. But when a spiritual seeker is able to attain his identity with Atman, then his mind becomes calm like an ocean with absolutely no waves, no currents, all calm and quiet. So here also Shankaracharya has something very, very important to mention here. So Bhashyakara says, Prashanta manasam prashantam mano yasya sa prashanta manaha tam prashanta manasam hi enam yoginam sukhamuttamam niradishayam upayidi upagacchati. So the prashanta means that prakashena shanta, all round tranquility and peace, complete tranquility and peace, like an ocean that is free from waves and currents and pebbles. Shantarajasam prakshina mohadi klesha rajasam ityarthaha. So what happens at such a stage? The mind completely is free from the distractions caused by Rajoguna and Tamoguna. All mohas, all desires, all wrong ideas, all distractions completely vanished. Brahmabhudam Jivan Muktam. A Jivan Mukta will have this mind, Prashanta Manasam, the mind like an ocean without any waves. Jivan Muktam. Brahma eva sarvam iti evam nischayavantam. Such a yogi thinks that everything is Brahman. See, an ocean, there are two ways of interpreting an ocean. You can, if you look at an ocean, a lot of high waves and currents, disturbances, then you will say here is an ocean which is highly disturbed. But suppose you realize that those waves and those currents also constitute the same water which constitute the ocean itself. Then you won't be disturbed by the currents. You will interpret ocean as one whole. So the currents and the waves also constitute water. They all emerge in the ocean. They exist in the ocean and they get dissolved in the ocean. They are not separate from the water which constitute the ocean. So a yogi, a Jivan Mukta, as you mentioned here, a Jivan Mukta, Brahma Bhudam Jivan Muktam, Brahma eva sarvam iti evam nischayavantam. So yogi who realizes everything is Brahman, there is nothing which is not Brahman, he is like a person who sees the same water in the ocean, in the waves, and also in the currents. So he'll be living in this world. He'll be interacting with the world in which we live. He may also be seeing all these things going on around us. But he is not disturbed because he understands that's the nature of the world. And the world itself is Nama Rupa. By its very nature, it is unsteady. So the world that we see is like a wave. If you look at the wave and separate it from the ocean, then you'll be disturbed. Or there's a big 100 feet wave, tsunami in the ocean. But when you look at the whole thing as one body made of the same water, then you won't be disturbed because the waves constitute the ocean. It's part of the ocean. It emerges in the ocean, it exists and also gets dissolved in the ocean. So Jivan Mukta, living in this world, is totally free from any kind of mental disturbances. That's why Lord Krishna says, Atmani eva atmana tushtaha sthita prajnaha tadocchiti. So Jivan Mukta, sthita prajna is a person who sees the whole phenomenon as one ocean, constituted by one water, which sometimes takes the form of a current, strong current, or a mighty tsunami waves, but then they all exist in the same ocean. So, after this, Lord Krishna takes up another interesting, important subject, that is the 28th verse that we will discuss in the coming session. And before conclusion, we have one announcement. We will have online worship of Divine Mother Kali Puja tomorrow, Saturday, 14th November, 7:30 p.m. in the evening. It will be broadcast on YouTube and live stream tomorrow, 14th November, 7:30, Kali Puja. And I wish all of you a happy Diwali. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.